So good afternoon. My name is Monica Patterson-Tuchka. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science, which used to be the Department of Government. And I'd like to welcome all of you to this wonderful panel on decolonizing comprehensive immigration reform. Before I introduce the panelists and we move into the substance of the discussion, I'd like to just say a few thank yous. First, I would like to thank everyone for coming. I know this is a busy time of the year. Students are busy, faculty are busy, the community is busy, but we're here to talk about immigration and immigration reform, which is a fundamental issue that's affecting all of our lives. And so thank you for taking an interest and for taking responsibility for this crucial issue. Second, I want to thank the Center on Race, Immigration, and Social Justice for sponsoring this forum, particularly Professor Manuel Barajas, Heidi Sarabia, and the rest of the Immigration Forum panel that did so much work to get this together, to get you here. It's really just tremendous to be invited to be the moderator. Finally, I want to thank the panelists, and I'm going to move quickly to briefly introducing them in the order on the program, and I'm going to try my best to get the Spanish right, but I'm sure many of you will laugh. First, Luis Magaña, who is the director of the Organización de Trabajadores Agrícolas de California. He will be speaking first. Second, Professor Nasreen Nuruddin, who's an assistant professor in the School of Nursing, who's very active in the refugee community here and who's received some outstanding service rewards on that because of that work. Professor Maria Vargas, assistant professor in the Ethnic Studies Department. Jesus Limon, who is a professor in the English department, who is a faculty dreamer, who is a DACA faculty, will be speaking to us, and I will be the moderator, and I will sit down and welcome Luis Magaña for 10 or 15 minutes to speak, and then I ask you to hold your questions to the end, and I will facilitate the question and answer period then. So without further ado, please open your ears to Luis Magaña. Thanks.
Buenas tardes al grupo Descolonizando para la Reforma Migratoria del profesor Parte Manuel Barajas y paisano haberme invitado a compartir nuestra lucha, nuestra experiencia.
So thank you for the group here to listen to the Decolonizing the Immigration Reform, and thank you to Professor Manuel Barajas for inviting me. They are from the same town, so they've known each other for many years, and he's thankful for him too.
Ojalá que sirva un poquito, que ayude un poquito mi experiencia y mi lucha organizando para en algún punto de sus estudios o de sus conocimientos.
I hope that my struggle organizing and in my studies help you in your own studies.
¿Cómo llegué aquí siendo joven con sueños de estudiar? Yo tenía un sueño de ir a la escuela, era el propósito y se lo prometí al consulado americano en la Ciudad de México que a eso venía.
So I came here when I was young with a dream to study, and I actually promised to the consulate of the United States over in Mexico, I promised them that I was coming here to study.
¿Pero qué pasó? ¿Por qué me convertí casi niño trabajando en los campos?
But what happened? Why did I go as a child to go work in the fields?
Y después organizando grupos para nuestros derechos por justicia social.
And after organizing groups for our rights for social justice?
El primer grupo fue en la escuela de Manteca.
The first group was in a Manteca school.
Cuando íbamos a la escuela y nos discriminaron y tuvimos que formar un grupo de estudiantes que ahora le llamarían pandillas.
So they discriminated against us, and we had to form a group of students who now they would call a gang.
Después viene trabajar en el campo, como trabajador del campo y escuchar todo la discriminación y abusos contra los trabajadores del campo.
Then I started working in the fields, and I started to hear about all the abuses that were going on against the field workers.
Me impulsó a formar una organización tipo mutualista de aquellos años que se llamaba Asociación Campesina Lázaro Cárdenas.
It motivated me to form an association, ¿cómo se dice? Mutualista?
Sí,
A mutualist type from back then,
de ayuda mutua entre los paisanos, entre los...
from mutual help amongst the people from Mexico.
Y bueno, éramos familias migrantes que íbamos 6 meses aquí trabajando y 6 meses en nuestro pueblo de origen.
So it was immigrant families that we were working here for 6 months, and then we would go back 6 months to our country of origin.
Pero antes, atrás, mi abuelo vino de trabajar. Mi abuelo nace en los campos de arroz, donde había enfermedades como el paludismo en Apatzingán, con las haciendas de los Cusi.
But before that, my grandpa was born into fields of rice over in Michoacán, where there were a lot of diseases.
Siendo de familias de mi pueblo, pero emigraban a trabajar en los arrozales con los hacendados españoles, italianos.
So that's how the people from my town were. They would migrate to work in the rice fields with us Italian.
Después
Farmers.
mi abuelo vino a trabajar dentro del primer programa bracero, producto de la Primera Guerra Mundial.
And then my grandpa came to work in the Bracero program, which was a product of the World War II.
Y mi padre regresa porque hubo la distribución de las tierras de Lázaro Cárdenas, vecino a nuestro pueblo, para distribuir tierras de una hacienda donde llevaron africanos, que había africanos a trabajar allí, y hay la mezcla de indígenas, afroafricanos y españoles donde nosotros nacimos.
So then my dad went back because the then president of Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas, was giving away land, and he went back for that. There was an hacienda where there were a lot of
Guaracha.
people from African descent that were there, and that's where the mixing started to happen.
Viene el programa Bracero 4264 y mi papá viene muy joven también a los 43 años.
So then the Bracero program happened, and my dad came also very young when he was 43 years old.
No, viene siendo muy joven en el año 43,
Okay.
1943.
So his dad came in 1943.
Crezco de una familia de padre temporal, como muchos de allí, en el pueblo.
So he comes from a family of a temporary father, like many of the families in that town.
Y conociendo las historias de los braceros, conociendo la historia del abuelo, la historia de los braceros, y actualmente nosotros trabajando en el campo, era como un círculo que se repetía, donde la migración era un factor muy importante, donde todo tornaba en el trabajo y el estatus migratorio.
So coming from a Bracero family is like a cycle where it happens over and over again when and everything revolves around migration status.
Se acaba el programa bracero y nos legaliza la familia y para trabajar en los campos, como ya decía anteriormente.
So when the Bracero program ended, their family was legalized and they remained working in the fields.
Pero cómo romper todo este círculo de ir y venir y trabajar en el campo y ver el terror de la migra en los campos. Había redadas en los campos, no, llegaban helicópteros bajo, como si fueran las películas de Vietnam. Llegaban los de la migra, pues, rodeaban los campos y nos sacaban a nuestros parientes que los cubríamos de matas de tomate.
So he remembers that there were raids in the fields when they were working. There were helicopters coming very low in the fields, and they had to hide the people that were undocumented amongst the weeds in there in the field.
Después del programa Bracero, 70s, 80s, esto pasó y hasta que vino la IRCA, la reforma migratoria del 86, 1986.
So that happened after the Bracero program in the 80s, and then it ended until IRCA, the immigration reform of 1986, happened.
Y sentimos otra vez el sueño para muchos de los que estaban sin documentos de volver a legalizarse con ese programa.
And those that were undocumented had the dream to become legalized with that program.
Y, sí, millones se legalizaron por el programa de trabajadores del campo y otros por el cierto tiempo que tenían ya acumulado.
And many were able to legalize, some of them for the program for field workers and others because they had been here for many years.
Pero ¿qué pasó después de esto? La gente que se legaliza por sus años, por su manera de crecer su familia, de no migrar, pues tienen que buscar opciones, la educación de sus hijos, las mejores oportunidades de trabajo, como el del desarrollo de las canerías, etcétera.
And then the families started to look for better opportunities for their kids, for education, and they started going into cannery factories.
Entonces nosotros en las huelgas que tuvimos en 1983, éramos indocumentados y éramos residentes legales.
So many of us in the strikes of 1983, a lot of us were undocumented and some of us were legal residents.
De pronto vimos una olada del sur de Asia, camboyanos, que llegaron a reemplazar a los agricultores para romper nuestra huelga.
And then we saw a lot of people coming from South Asia that were coming to break the strike.
Los vimos como enemigos hasta que logramos a través de Caridades Católicas tener comunicación con ellos para que se unieran al movimiento.
And first we saw each other as enemies until we were able to establish communications through Catholic Charities, and we talked them into joining the movement.
Vienen los últimos años de las últimas décadas y vemos otro flujo que llena los campos agrícolas. No es en la gran cantidad como los refugiados del sur de Asia o los que ya estábamos de residentes legales, sino que vemos una gran olada de trabajadores agrícolas indocumentados, entre ellos muchas familias indígenas.
And then there was another influx of a lot of undocumented families that were coming, and a lot of them were indigenous.
Y si vamos a los campos agrícolas, vemos no una lengua, varias lenguas del sur de México que se hablan con mucha fluidez y mucha comunicación entre las cuadrillas.
If we go to the fields, we can see that there's a lot of languages from the southern states of Mexico, dialects that are spoken in the fields.
Quiero agradecer a Georgina que me acompañó. Ella es una trabajadora agrícola que habla náhuatl del estado de Guerrero y es nuestra maestra de clase de náhuatl.
I want to thank Georgina, who's here with me today. She's one of the teachers for us, and she speaks Nahuatl.
¿Qué está pasando ahorita? Que por años hemos levantado la voz y la bandera por una reforma migratoria.
So what's happening right now? That for many years we have raised our voices in favor of an immigration reform.
Porque día con día vemos la situación que está en los campos.
Because day by day we see the situation that's going on in the fields.
El tráfico humano de gentes que traen trabajadores sin documentos a trabajar en los campos y están sujetos a las condiciones del que los trae o del patrón que los recibe.
The human trafficking that's going on with field workers because they are brought here to work in the fields and they have to stay there regardless of the treatment that they receive.
El problema que existe es de que algo más está sucediendo. Vemos que la supuesta demanda de trabajadores agrícolas en los campos que hay ahorita, que se están quejando de que ciertas cosechas no hay suficiente gente.
So we see there's a lot more demand in the fields, that they're complaining that there's not enough people for the harvest.
Licorerías, tiendas de comida donde frecuenta nuestra comunidad, los letreros, necesitamos gentes para trabajar en XX cultivo.
There's a lot of markets, liquor stores, and places like that our community often goes to, and they are you can see signs that they need people to work there.
Sube el precio, estamos pagando $12, más del salario mínimo. Por primera vez se ve eso, que les ofrecen la oferta de trabajo.
So the prices go up. They are paying a lot more now. They're paying $12, $13 an hour, and it's the first time that happens because of the demand.
Ahí en el condado San Joaquín se vio de que más de 600 trabajadores llegan con permisos H2A.
So in San Joaquin County, we saw that many workers come with H-2A visas
a trabajar en un cultivo de la blueberry, de la arándano.
to work in a field of blueberries.
Estuvimos trabajando cercas con este grupo, los hospedan en hoteles, el hotel cierra sus puertas para otro tipo de que llegue a rentar y se convierten en hoteles grandes, en campamentos en la ciudad urbanos de trabajadores, sin supervisión.
So we have been working with this group. They stay in hotels. The hotel itself closes its doors for any other customers, and they become like campments for the workers.
Por otro lado, vemos en ciertos campos que están sembrando más, más miles de acres para futuros trabajadores H2A.
On the other side, we see that in other fields there are sembrando.
Preparándolos para sembrar la blueberry.
Okay, they are. ¿Cómo se dice sembrando? Okay, so they are growing more blueberries, getting ready for more H-2A workers.
Familias que ahorita trabajan en el campo, que ya tienen 10 o 15 años trabajando, como la familia de Georgina, como la familia de otras personas, se les empieza a cerrar las puertas cada vez más con su falta de documentos, su estatus migratorio.
So families that have been working in the fields for many years, like 10, 15 years, like Georgina's family, the doors start to close on them because of their lack of immigration status.
Y se empieza a hablar más de una cultura de permisos, de visas legales para que trabajes en el campo.
And we're starting to talk more about a culture of permits or visas to do it legally, to work in the fields.
A 75 años de que surgió el programa Bracero, el de los años 40,
So 75 years later of the second Bracero program from the 1940s,
se está mirando una situación muy triste en los campos porque tenemos a los trabajadores H2A, tenemos a las familias indocumentadas, tenemos a los residentes legales y tenemos a algunos que sí nacieron aquí en este país.
we're seeing a very sad situation in the fields because we have the H-2A workers, we have the undocumented workers, some of them are legal residents, and also some of them were born here.
Vemos la situación que está ahorita, hay programas, reajustes en el programa H2A que acaba de anunciar en estos días la administración de Donald Trump, y vemos otro programa también igualmente donde les quieren dar cierto tipo de permisos a los trabajadores del campo, que hay propuestas a nivel federal y basados en un buen y limpio récord.
So we see that recently the Trump administration made adjustments to the H-2A visa program, and there's also talks at the national level to give work permits to the field workers, but of course they have to have a clean record.
¿Qué estamos haciendo con nosotros como organización independiente de apoyo a trabajadores del campo y de la comunidad indocumentada?
So what are we doing as a group that supports the field workers and the undocumented community?
Habemos foros que hablan de tus derechos,
We do forums that talk about their rights,
pero no hay una educación histórica de estos movimientos que se están dando, que se estamos reciclando, y estamos creyendo que el sueño de esta reforma que están planteando va a solucionar el problema de la migración.
but there's no a historic education about the movements that we are recycling and building on. So we believe that just the immigration reform will solve the
En mi
problem.
reciente viaje a Michoacán, a nuestra tierra ya en febrero, la gente ya no habla del coyote, el que ayudaba a brincar el cerco, el desierto. Ahora hablan, ¿sabes quién es la compañía que me puede ayudar a dar una visa para trabajar?
So in my recent trip to Michoacán, I noticed that people don't talk about the coyotes anymore, the people who will help you or smuggle you into the country. Now they talk about companies. Like, do you know any company that will give me a visa
Legalmente.
to go legally?
De estos trabajadores de Stockton que fueron, se los llevó la compañía Munger de Visalia, se los lleva a Sumas, Washington.
So those workers from Stockton, there's a company that takes them to Washington,
Los legales,
the legal ones.
allá muere uno de ellos,
One of them dies over there.
Otros protestan y a todos los despiden, 70, 80 trabajadores.
So the other ones started protesting and everybody got fired.
Pero ¿qué
about
pasaba
70.
de la condición en Stockton? Al menos 5 personas se les paralizó el rostro.
But what happened in Stockton with the conditions over there? At least 5
No
people
los,
had
la compañía
paralysis.
no los atendía. Nosotros nos ofrecimos a ayudarlos a agarrar su medicamento básico para que se curaran.
And the company didn't provide medical services for them. We offered ourselves to help them get the basic medicine they needed.
Antes de que se fueran a Washington hicieron 2 grupos. Ustedes no rindieron la producción, se regresan a México.
Before they took him to Washington, they actually made 2 groups. One of them were the ones that didn't live up to the standards, so they were sent back to Mexico.
No se prohíbe tomar fotos en los campos
They prohibited from taking
o
pictures
hablar con gente como nosotros.
or talk to people like us.
Eso es el sistema de la administración que va a responder con una reforma migratoria al sector laboral agrícola que vemos venir.
That is the system that's going to answer to the immigration reform.
Un sistema aún, se puede decir, peor que lo que fue el programa Bracero.
A system that we can say is worse than what the Bracero program
Porque
was.
quienes los reclutan también en México son gente envuelta en el crimen organizado.
Because the people in Mexico that recruit the workers are people who are also involved in organized crime
Y que cobran sus cuotas.
and that they charge for their quota.
Entonces, la situación esta producción, este boom de la agricultura, lo que menos está importando es la situación de los trabajadores que ya están aquí, que ya tienen experiencia y que se les está cerrando cada vez más las puertas aquí.
So in this boom of agriculture, the workers that have already been here, they are not taken care of because the doors are closing on them.
La organización es una parte importante, pero el desconocimiento de la sociedad es mucho más grande. La gente, incluso el propio sheriff, no se daba cuenta y la policía estando enfrente, donde estaban los trabajadores, la gente que estaba viviendo allí.
Organizing is an important part, but also knowing the society, the sheriff himself didn't know what was going on there.
Y el control de las corporaciones agrícolas internacionales van a ser los nuevos que van a guiar el futuro de la fuerza laboral si es que no nos organizamos, si es que no tenemos una voz en Washington y si es que aquí también, porque son hermanos que vienen, ellos no tienen la culpa, no es estar peleando contra ellos, sino simplemente ellos desconocen la historia de Braceros, ellos desconocen las historias de lucha que se ha hecho aquí y eso se usa a beneficio de que ellos van a desconocer las leyes básicas que ya se han conseguido en los movimientos laborales.
So it's not that we're against them, they are our brothers, but they don't know the history of the braceros here in the United States, so it's important to organize.
Migrantes de ayer, migrantes de hoy, no es otra cosa que esclavos sin grilletes.
Immigrants from yesterday, immigrants from today, there is nothing more than slaves without chains.
Yo creo que ya. ¿Está bien? Ok. Gracias.
As we've heard, oppression is an international thing that's happening all over the world. But today, to make the image clearer with refugees, I'm going to share with you a few slides that talks about refugees. Because sometimes images speak more than words, and it's a better way to express what we see. Oppression is not just here, oppression is all over the world, and it's also globally, and we have a share in causing this. Refugees are basically coming from all over the world, some of them to the United States, some of them to other places. And the number is much higher from what you see here on the screen. Now it's 67.5 million refugees, the biggest since the beginning, the establishment of the United Nations. This has never been before, to have these many people displaced because of war and because of oppression. These are some of the data we have here in the United States. I am more concerned of these people because this is what the community I serve. I serve Afghanistan, people coming, refugees coming from Afghanistan, from Iran, from Iraq, and from Syria. Now the numbers dropped by 40% since Trump came in office, which is bad. This is what people are fleeing. This is destruction in Syria, and we have a big role as the United States in causing this destruction and in supporting this destruction and providing weapons for this destruction. Millions of homes were destroyed. People have nothing left to stay for, to fight for. This is now the new thing that's happening in Yemen. I don't know how many of you heard about Yemen and the war in Yemen. This country is one of the poorest countries in the Middle East, and they have been besieged for 2 years now and having airstrikes and killed. 7 million people are severely food insured according to the United Nations. This is the biggest famine in the history that is man-made. Millions of people are dying. Children are dying because of lack of food. And the United Nations is not allowed to take food and aids there. And we're silent. We lost touch with our humanity. We're no more dealing with each other as human beings. And I think we need to get over that. We all have similar stories. We all share the same narrative. Why we are so separated from each other. Why we're siloed. Why we're allowing this to happen to us. We are all having and practicing conformity. We're allowing politicians to play us against each other. You're Mexican, I am Arab, you're Muslim, I'm Christian. This is not true. We're all human beings. And we are all responsible for what's happening, even if it's happening miles away. We are all now interconnected. We're in a small world with our media, with our phones, with our internet access. We cannot claim that we're not seeing and hearing anymore. It's our responsibility as a human beings to see what's going on around us and to take care of this. The travel ban, it puts ban on people coming from Syria. It's putting ban on people coming from Yemen. Why? Are these the terrorists we're afraid of? People who are hungry? Or are we trying to hide what we're doing? Or are we trying to hide the reality? We don't want the people in this nation to see what's going on over there. We don't want them to see that our hands are polluted with innocent blood because we're allowing the Saudis to kill these millions of people. They paid us for it, and we kept silence. We went there, our president went there, he received billions of dollars in gifts and gold, and it was the price for silence. Silence to see a human massacre happening, millions of kids and people who are gonna die hungry. This is the message I'm bringing to you today from refugees, because it's not just trying to stop this. We need to stop wars before we can really talk about how we can fix this situation for us and for others. And it's not only that. They don't have even access to clean water. They have the biggest outbreak of cholera in the world. Over 500,000 people are having cholera. And do you think this is not going to come to us somehow? Diseases travel, and it moves in the world because of the traveling now. We may end up spreading this on other countries because they are moving to other countries and they are afraid of dying wherever they are. And we have close to, this is in the other slide, hundreds of thousands of people who have died from cholera, over 2,000 people who died from cholera, and then 500,000 who have cholera. And the United Nations and the UNICEF are talking. They're having reports. Go to their website and you'll see it. But nobody's taking any step. Nobody's taking action. So when refugees flee their countries, these are the conditions they run away with. They go under different weather situations to neighboring countries. They cross borders. This is one of the camps in Lebanon. I am originally coming from Lebanon, but I've been here for a long time. In Lebanon, the refugees are living under snow, in tents, and hundreds of them die every year. We have close to 1.5 million Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And they are living in very miserable conditions because Lebanon is a poor country, and they cannot afford to support them and help them. Let alone talking about their education and other situations. And if they survive, they apply for refugee status in countries like the United States. The vetting process takes between 2 to 5 years. Our president is complaining about the vetting process. They go through a very grueling vetting process, and it takes 2 to 5 years for them to get permission to get here. Those of them who do not get a visa or cannot wait the 2 to 5 years because they run out of money, because they run out of anything they have, they don't have other options but trying to cross seas, like what's happening between Turkey and Cyprus, or what's happening between Yemen and Africa. They take the risk of dying while crossing the sea. And if they come here, and if they settle, what are they faced with? They need to learn the language, they need to learn the culture, they need to face the discrimination, they need to face the oppression, they are deprofessionalized, they are manipulated because they are used to do jobs similar to what the Mexican population is going through with a very minimum pay, and they are not offered health insurance, they are exploited. So we see all of these things. But then, on top of that, they're considered terrorists. And we should be afraid of them because they are terrorists. And we should not be treating them well because according to the polls, 50% of the people in the United States don't have favorable image of Islam. So more of the issues that they face here. So it's not easy. It's not easy to be a refugee in a country like the US or any other country, thinking that you're coming, that all your problems are going to be solved, that you're coming to a new place, you're going to have all your dreams accomplished, but then you're faced with all these hardships and all these difficulties. Let alone all the PTSD, post-traumatic stress that they have in their own countries because of the war, because of losing their homes, because of losing their loved ones, and having some loved ones who are still there. When they come here, we put a ban on them. You cannot have your family come here. You cannot go visit your family there. You're not allowed to move across borders. All of them now are afraid. They're afraid even to go see or check on their families who are still there because they're afraid that they're not going to be allowed to come here. When we had the first travel ban, many of them were deprived from their visas. I know personally someone who she went to check on a sick family member, her mother, and when she was coming back with a green card and she doesn't speak the language, they took from her passport, her green card, and shredded in front of her after having her sign a paper that she didn't know what she signed on, which was a form basically saying that I'm giving up my green card. And many other stories are happening. And because of the anti-Islamic sentiment that's now our president is having and perpetuating, people are giving themselves license to attack Muslims and to be mean to Muslims and mistreat Muslims in this country. And basically what we see, many cases of Muslim women whom they took off their scarf or head cover from their heads, like one case that happened in Long Beach where a police officer removed the headscarf of a woman because of a traffic violation, and he wanted to search her himself. When she asked for a woman, for a female to search her and refused to take her headscarf, he did not listen to that. He did not respect that. He took her headscarf and he said, we are allowed to search women. Now we have civil rights organizations that are taking care of that, and they fined him. The court fined him $85,000, and they changed the policy to respect religious freedom for people. But it's not easy. It doesn't come easy. So we need to build coalitions. This is what we can do here. What we need to do is basically to join forces, to work together. You as a Latino community, or us as a Muslim community, or other communities, we need to all join forces. This is how we can really win. Because the culture of this country is built on diversity. And our diversity should be stronger with our unity. And this is what history has told us. Many people went through this before us. It's not just us. The Jewish, when they first came here, they were discriminated against. They were mistreated. But you know what? Diversity wins. And history showed us that America wins because the culture of this country, we don't have a common language. We don't speak a common language. We have people coming from all different parts of the world. We don't have common culture. We don't have a common ethnicity. But what really binds us is our common story and our common narrative. We're all immigrants. We all came here. We all have a story. This is why we need to work together in order to let this story unfold by itself. And it's going to unfold similar to what happened to the Jews, similar to what happened to the Catholics when they first came here. They were all attacked and they were all ridiculed and they were all discriminated against. But then what happened? The story unfolded and they became part of this country. And we're going to be the same. It needs patience, but it needs some hard work from our side in order to get there. And I think maybe I took more of my time. So this is what we need to do. And the main thing I would like to say that refugees would like you to look at them with a positive eye, not a negative eye. We don't want to look at them with a deficit model. We need to look with a model of strength because they are coming with lots of resources, of skills, and of things that we can use for our favor. Like we have over 150 physicians among refugees in California. Why not to use them in order to help our areas where we don't have enough physicians? We have many, they are all highly educated and they have degrees. We need to put that to use and not allow the system to exploit them. So we need to break silos, we need blend coalitions, we need to work together and try to really advocate for us. And this is the message we have from refugees to all of you. We need to stop the influx of refugees, and the only way we can do it is by stopping the wars, not by preventing them from coming here as refugees. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. As mentioned earlier, my name is Jesus Limon. I am a lecturer here in the English department. I am also a dreamer, a DACA recipient, a DACA faculty member. I came to the country when I was 8 years old. My mother brought me here. That piece is important. I'll talk a little bit about that later, about like the role that my mother had. But once I got here, we connected again with my father. My father, to give you a little bit of background, had a lot of what I think I like to call like cheap charisma. You know, he kind of like grew up in a small town in Mexico, right, in Guadalajara, in Jalisco. And he grew up in this small town, very, not too much formal education, grew up sort of like herding cattle and things of this nature, right? And so he kind of just figured his way through life just based on, this sort of knowledge that he acquired in his own life through his own ways, right? I share that with you because when I came to Sacramento, when my family and I came to Sacramento, my dad had all these unique ways of introducing me to language, to education, right? And one of the things that my dad did when I was younger, when I was 8, is that he did not allow me to hang out with like a lot of our neighbors that were predominantly, like Mexican neighbors or immigrant neighbors or Latino neighbors, Chicano neighbors. He didn't allow me to do that because he thought, if you just hang out with these kids, you're never gonna learn English, right? And I need you to learn English because I need you to like carry on the family, right? Because he was like, I hardly know how to speak my own language, Spanish, so I don't know that I'm gonna have the capacity to learn the language. So he prompted me to move, he was like, go hang out with these kids, go hang out with those kids, but you cannot hang out with these kids, right? So he prompted me to like hang out predominantly with growing up in South Sac, my community was predominantly African American, and Latino immigrant. So I predominantly grew up in the African American community, in the Black community, and learned how to speak English through hip hop, learned how to speak English through music, through art, through culture, right? The reason why that's important is because as I grew up, the way that I learned who I was, the way that I learned the way that I developed my own sort of self-identity was uniquely influenced by, having a strong mother, right? That when my father left us, she said, and you have to excuse my language, after my father left us, my mom was like, "Ni madres," you know what I mean? Like, I'm following you. Like, if you leave me, I'm gonna go find you. And my mom did. My mom went and found my dad on the other side of the country because she took an oath, right? Because she said, "Till death do us part. I don't care what you have to say about it. I'm keeping my end of the deal," right? And so my mom, that courage that my mom had, that kind of charisma that my dad had, right? All that influenced who I am. Does that make sense, right? So like that influenced my identity. And then the way that I acquired language had a tremendous influence in identifying or developing narratives or aesthetics that were in direct contrast with mainstream. Does that make sense, right? Because I learned English and I learned about myself through non-mainstream manners, right? So I've always known about who I was. I always aspired to be something that was native to my community, that was native to my experience. I never had any, goals to be something I wasn't. It was never seen as a negative to want to be, to be Latino. It was never seen as a negative to be undocumented. I never grew up thinking that being undocumented was a negative thing. Even growing up in the 90s and facing a Proposition 187, which was a law that would have outlawed services, educational services, to young undocumented immigrants. Even though we faced that in the 90s, I come from the community where my neighbors will say, like, "Don't even worry about that. Like, we got you. If something happens, you can live with us." My little kids that grew up next to me that didn't understand the whole law that would offer love and support and service. It did not allow me to adopt the narrative of the mainstream that said you should be afraid, you should feel bad for yourself, you guys get what I'm saying? Like, I never adopted that because I had so much love in my community, right? So fast forward to me receiving a bachelor's, a master's, becoming a organizer in my community, believing that literacy can lead to healing, believing that literacy can lead to empowerment. I became first a tutor, later a grant writer, and most recently assistant professor of English at Sacramento City College and an English lecturer here through DACA, right? And through those means, I was able to then develop new ideas, right? About like, okay, now what can I do to continue to give back, right? What can I do for all of the younger dreamers that are currently facing discrimination, that are currently facing fear? What can I do to empower them? How can I use my tools? How can I use the things that are native to me to help others? And out of that came these 3 different projects, right? So first, the first project actually started here at Sac State, right, in collaboration with the Dreamer Resource Center. My first initial idea, given that the coordinator of the Dreamer Resource Center was a former student of mine, I reached out to her and I said, "Hey, listen, Norma, I want to do some things. I have some funding available just through my own means. I would like to develop a scholarship." And she hit me back and said, "We already have funding available for a scholarship, but why don't we do something more with that? Why don't we develop some sort of creative project?" And obviously I was all about that. I helped create this Narratives of a Dream project. We were intentional about the way that we recruited dreamers. We didn't use paper applications because those paper applications oftentimes alienate dreamers, right? Because they don't want to document who they are and their presence here in the country. So it was all verbal, oral introductions and things of that nature. So that project allowed students to receive scholarships by attending weekly meetings where they learned to write their stories, right? So they wrote autoethnographic text, right? So they did research on issues of impacting dreamers and then told their stories through the current issues, right? And so we did that for 1 semester. They received a scholarship and took it a step beyond that, told their stories then through a documentary that was used to empower other educators, right? And so that right there served as a model for me of like, man, we don't have to change who we are. We don't have to feel sorry for who we are. We could be strong. We can be empowered, and we can use our empowerment to empower others, right? And that's true power, right? Not just having our healing be for ourselves, but having our healing be for somebody else's healing, right? So out of that project, then we took it a step further. We developed a learning community. We ran a learning community for first-year students. We ran a learning community for transfer students. Out of that kind of initiative, then we went into the high school space. I went to my former high school, Luther Burbank High School in South Sacramento, and produced a project that, with collaboration with Elizabeth Villanueva, a Spanish teacher, we empower a collective of dreamers. About 30 dreamers showed up every Wednesday after school, and they learned about how to tell their stories, right? They were able to talk about their fears, they were able to talk about, their struggles, but they were also able to talk about the strengths of their families, right? And the strengths of their parents and themselves, right? And how, and they were able to see themselves through a different light. We went to San Francisco, we visited the Mission District, we saw the previous ways that communities have entered the country with pride, right? They told their own stories. They created pieces of art so they can own their sense of identity. And then most recently, they were able to then, advocate for themselves in the school board, and now are on their way of building a Dreamer Resource Center at their high school, right? So again, the telling of their stories, the healing of themselves through literacy, empower them to acquire resources that the local agencies had for them, but the Sacramento City Unified School District was happy to claim their response to the Trump administration, their own response, right, by making a safe haven, but there wasn't any kind of programming. The students took it upon themselves to develop the programming. Does that make sense? The students took it upon themselves to advocate for themselves, and it was only after they had gone through this project of healing through literacy and art, right? And then most recently, with a group of Sacramento City College students, similar project, students met. We collaborated with local restaurants to make sure that we have safe spaces, right? The restaurant South on TN11 allowed us to meet in the back of the restaurant so we could have secure conversations about who we are and how we want to support the community. So we gathered, we met consistently, about 8 of us, and then applied for local resources to attend the Haku conference in Washington, D.C., right? And advocate for the Bridge Act, right? So the Bridge Act previously, last year, was a reform to make DACA a law as opposed to an executive order. So through this experience, we were able to go to Matsui's office, meet with her, let her know about our story, letting her know that we were from her district, and pushing for this notion. And so the thing that I want to bring up is that consistently, as I look at empowering communities and as I look at decolonizing our experience, is really about finding ways to not be shaped by the narratives that exist outside of us, right? So being certain that the narratives that are told about us come from us, right? Being certain that we put out narratives that unite us with other communities, that we put out narratives that create conflict in the mainstream narrative about what it means to be a dreamer, what it means to be a DACA recipient, what it means to be an immigrant in general, right? And the only way that I think we're able to do that is by taking the tools that already exist, not only native to us in terms of our own home cultures, but also the tools that we've been awarded, right, because of our privilege to have access to higher education, right? So the reason why I was able to fund all these things is because I learned how to write grants when I was an undergrad. You know what I mean? So it's about repurposing those tools, not necessarily for the exploitation of our communities, but for the empowerment of our communities, right? So both being empowered by our stories, our native experiences, and the tools that we have privilege to. And not letting our healing be just healing for the sake of healing, but actually healing for the sake of empowerment. And that's really what I wanted to share with you guys today. Thank you.
My name is Marielena Vargas, and this is my first semester here at Sac State. I'm assistant professor in ethnic studies. So I'll be talking about the social and legal challenges of recent Central American immigrants, in particular women and children, that they face, right, attempting to come to the U.S. or trying to stay here. Just to give a little background, I do identify as Chicana, Latina. My parents both are Mexican immigrants. I grew up here in the Bay Area, and then when I was about a teenager, we moved to southern New Mexico, to the frontera of Juarez, El Paso, Las Cruces, so that my mom be closer to her family. But I attended graduate school, or my PhD, at a University of Maryland in College Park. And that was my first time I'd ever been to the East Coast, and here I am, living 7 years of my life. And it was that experience, living in the Mid-Atlantic, that really reshaped who I was as a Latina. It made me just rethink my own Mexicanness as well, in terms of growing up in California in the Southwest, reflect on my own privilege, even that of my parents as Mexican immigrants, right? But compared to the social conditions, political kind of situations that I saw firsthand in the DC, Maryland, Virginia region affecting recently arrived Central American immigrants, particularly Salvadorans, Guatemalans, right? To take a Latino studies class at University of Maryland was to take a Central American literature class. And in those classes, right, I read about the civil wars in the different countries. And specifically when I got to Guatemala and read about the genocide in 1984, the 36-year Civil War, which is the largest of any Latin American country, the attempted extermination of indigenous Ichil people, right, the sanctuary movement, all of that forever marked me and changed me. And it was stories that just haunted me, and I could not walk away. And that's why now I'm completely committed to that, to my work in Central American Studies or Guatemala. And it's interesting because many people say, right, what's a Chicana doing in Guatemala or studying Central Americans? And I think sometimes, you know, that we need to be careful of that thinking because it's very much geared by identity politics. And to me, to learn about genocide and war in, I guess, current day Guatemala, right, to me, challenged me in different ways or spoke to me in a way that previously, or perhaps how I had been introduced or exposed to Chicana Mexican American history did not. It made me reflect deeper on my own indigeneity, right? And that's what, to me, there are no nation borders that should define that, or no identity or nationalist agenda, right? And to me, as Latinos, Latinx people, right, we need to look beyond, or yes, we can be proud. I'm very proud of my Mexicano culture, but we need to look beyond the Mexico border, right, and look at our Guatemalan, Honduran, El Salvadoran brothers and sisters and not get caught up in these internal kind of battles and containers, right, especially when we're talking about right now Central Americans, specifically the countries that they call the Northern Triangle, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, because they are the largest, quote unquote, sending countries of immigrants. And look at the perilous, just impossible, harsh conditions, just crossroads of death that they're in, right? I think that as Latinx community, that's who should be at our front lines, and that's who we should actually be prioritizing as well. And also staying attuned, as I will talk a little bit in terms of my own research, that it's the immigrants, right, or it's the asylum seekers, primarily in the past 10 years, I would say, concerning Guatemala, that are indigenous women. And now, right, in 2014, we were introduced to the so-called migrant surge or humanitarian crisis of, quote unquote, unaccompanied minors. I don't like to use that word, right? I think it's a dehumanizing word, as is family units, right? Family units means women traveling with children. Unaccompanied minors means a child traveling alone, right? So right now, they're in limbo, or they're constantly being deported back to their deaths. So I want to share actually my work around children and women in terms of 2014 on is some of my newer work. My research initially focused on the study of feminicides, right, which is the genocide of women, right, this war on women's bodies during peacetime in countries such as El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, right? So I look at this circular or secular violence, right, to center indigenous women in the way that they have been targeted by racialized, sexualized violence since colonialism, the Civil War, and current day feminicides. Many of the times when we talk about gender violence in terms of Latin America, we think of Mexico, las mujeres de Juárez, right, since the 1990s, more than 500 plus women. So I don't like to keep up with the statistics at times, but that's what we think about, right? The tortured, mutilated bodies of these, many of them maquiladora workers, poor indigenous women that were migrating from southern Mexico to la frontera with Juárez, right, in Tijuana. But again, right, going further past the Mexican border, Guatemala since the 2000s, since the year 2000, has had more than 1,000 feminicides. Like the number is just extreme and it is sensationalized. And sometimes I'm careful how to use those statistics, right? But sometimes it's hard to find that boundary when you're already in such extreme violence, right? So thinking about what it means, especially the indigenous woman finding herself, right, again, in these very harsh conditions of violence and survival during these different periods, right? And the impunity of sexual violent crimes to the point that feminicides, that's the reason why there's 95+% impunity rate in Guatemala and Mexico, because a lot of these women, right, are found sexually mutilated. And that still, even in its all excess, right, and visibility, is still very much taboo or silenced within their own community, local community, and also in the courtroom, right? So another thing to understand, right, is, as I said, my newer work is looking at this transnational flow of indigeneity and sexual violence, particularly indigenous women fleeing Guatemala, because since the early 1980s, right? No, 1990s, when the Civil War ended in Guatemala, indigenous women have been the highest asylum seekers in Latin America, and at the same time, they compose the highest rate of being denied. So what exactly does this mean, right? So again, I wanted to, another thing I wanted to point out, right, is this understanding of genocide, right, our understanding of how we see a refugee, right, of how we kind of envision the political agency of a refugee or an immigrant, especially, right, in the 1960s, 70s, where a lot of Mexicano, right, migrant men fleeing, or not fleeing, but coming to the US, right? What I think is so particular about these indigenous Guatemalan women is that they shatter all of the masculine, patriarchal, racist lens of who a revolutionary is, of who a refugee is, right? Especially when we're talking about the context of genocide, right? The United Nations was quick to determine and confirm, yes, right? The indigenous genocide did occur in 1984 under the dictatorship of Efraín Ríos Montt against the Maya Ichil, right? People of the northern highlands of Guatemala, right? But sexual violence, right? The use of rape as war, the use of sexual reproductive violence, right, against indigenous women was not a strategic plan. Therefore, it is not part of the genocide, right? So the imagined kind of victimhood that we see is a campesino indigenous man. That's what I argue makes it harder for these women as they apply for asylum, right, to prove that burden, right, or to prove, that burden of proof, right? And as well, what we saw in the Civil War, remember 36 years of ensuing military dictators, right? Which again, and we can talk about this later, but it's all about Latin America or U.S. intervention, right? The 1954 U.S. CIA overthrow of the only civilian president, Jacobo Arbenz. And if you look at the Northern Triangle, right, what gets represented in the media and in the law as, oh, the most dangerous Central American countries where the MS-13 members come from. If you study the U.S. intervention of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala, you will see the extreme, right, influence and just complete destruction and deterioration in terms of the U.S. to any type of land reform or any type of revolution that those three countries were attempting back in the 60s and 70s. And another important aspect to understand about the Civil War in Guatemala is that during those 36 years, right, there was, of course, extreme, grave sexual violence and disappearance, and 200,000 disappeared, right? Genocide, crimes against humanity, anything, you name it, happened in Guatemala during the Civil War. But the main perpetrators were the military. So that means that they were state actors. So a lot of the asylum seekers then, especially after the 90s or early 2000s, Guatemalan asylum seekers who proved that their family, right, was directly affected because they were part of the guerrilla or another revolutionary organization, and can say, right, that they feel threatened because of the state sanctioned violence they experience. Many of them do get approved for asylum. But what has happened now is post-Civil War, right, and now in the current day of feminicide and extreme corruption in Guatemala, what happens now is that the main perpetrator of violence, right, is not the soldier or the military dictator or the politician, it's the family members, right, that are a lot of the perpetrators of domestic and sexual violence. So then what you have is women, right, Guatemalan women, specifically indigenous women, but all women, then many of their asylum claims, right, since the early 2000s are based on domestic violence and sexual violence. They don't want to go back to Guatemala because, right, either their husband, their brother, their uncle, etc., right, is the perpetrator, and they are threatening their lives, right, or not stopping this type of violence. And when they then, as a woman or a community or their family who supports them, try to access police or other type of human rights resources in the area, they are completely shut down. It is completely inefficient, right? And that's the problem with asylum law as well, with U.S. asylum law, that it is not developed to understand, right, violence perpetrated by non-state actors. And I also just wanted to, so that's more so the research or the bulk of the work that I've been working on. And the newer work is specifically looking at the 2014, right, quote, humanitarian crisis. So I just want to read a couple of my passages. Quote, or in the summer of 2014, media headlines reading, "Migrant Search and Humanitarian Crisis," followed by photographs of children and women sitting on the rooftops of La Bestia and children sleeping in overcrowded detention centers, became the reference point for American audiences in understanding recently arrived Central American children, traveling alone, and women traveling with their children. The sensationalized media coverage fueled the already extremist, racist, and nativist anxieties towards immigrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. And it was reflected in headlines such as, quote, "Surge of illegal children accelerates," quote, end quote, or public comments made by politicians who viewed the new immigrants as, quote, "seasoned criminals and gangbangers." Remember, these are children. Many of them were under 10 to 12, 14 years old, not even teenagers. And hordes, quote, hordes of uneducated, unskilled, and disease-ridden alien children. So what I argue as well, right, is because, remember, this is 2014, I believe it's before the midterm elections, and because, the kind of stalling of Congress on comprehensive immigration reform, right, at that point, this massive exodus of these brown, right, people at the U.S.-Mexican border, right, really very much triggered an extreme, right, draconian response, especially from the Obama administration. Right? This nativist rhetoric took advantage of the increase of immigrants arriving in this tense political climate, right? Therefore, then, and these are women and children. We had never before seen this type of migrant flow through the U.S. Mexican border, right? But they became the brunt of, right, embodied the national security threat of our borders, right? The failure of Washington to come up with immigration reform, right? So according to data from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, 68,000 women and children were apprehended in 2014, and 75% were from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The women and children were escaping violence from these non-state actors, right? Gang violence, extreme conditions, government and police corruptions in their home country. A glaring absence from the media outcry and public opinion, or, oh my God, they're coming and invading our borders, is that all of them were turning themselves in. They were turning themselves in because they were applying for asylum, right? So that's another thing we need to understand. They were applying for affirmative asylum. Another thing that just gets completely erased is the role of the Mexican state, right? So the perilous passage through Mexico, that is especially dangerous for women and children who are subjected to extortion, sexual assault, kidnapping, human trafficking, and forced disappearances. For example, Central American advocacy groups cite 70,000 disappearances of Central American migrants in Mexico, right? And what I think is also very terrifying is now that we have President or Trump, right, calling on to his Mexican friends, now he's friends with Peña Nieto, and saying we need to get rid, right, we need to kill all those MS-13, right, of course, right, vilifying, right, kind of representing all Central Americans through the MS-13, gang member, and saying, now it's the work is not so much the U.S.-Mexico border, it's the Mexican-Guatemalan border. And Mexico has to help us, right, not even allow Central Americans to get to the U.S. And another interesting thing is that now majority of the asylum claims are not coming from the U.S., they're actually coming from Mexico, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua, because many of the immigrants don't even make it here. Right, and that's not even to include the detention centers in which many of these women and children are being currently held captive in. Right, part of Obama administration deterrent strategy was called no release detention. So instead of these women and children being detained back to their home country, they are currently detained against their own will in these detention centers and not being released to their families or sponsors when they are once again under the process of seeking for asylum. So thank you so much for your attention.
I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions, but there isn't a lot of time. So if you could maybe keep your questions concise and maybe get 3 or 4 questions from the audience before there's a response. Is there anyone who wants to start asking some questions? Yes, go ahead.
I apologize, I arrived a little late, but I don't know if the panel had addressed this issue or not. Is anybody aware about AB 638? It's an assembly bill that was actually pushed forward. It's a 2-year bill now that's going before the Senate Appropriations Committee in the next legislative session that will eliminate immigration consultants, that will eliminate affordable access to immigration services, legal or document preparation services, as a form of, to me, that's a form of continued oppression.
So questions about AB 638. Anybody else have some questions in the audience? Does the panel want to respond?
I know that it was targeting a lot of the consultants that were overcharging people for immigration services, but the nonprofits that still have low-cost services are still going to be able to provide those services.
Actually, that's not the case. When you read the bill, it's actually an elimination of the entire profession. And the crux of the issue was quote unquote notarios, that there's notarios fraud, persons perpetuate a fraud on the immigrant community, that they are authorized document preparers when they're not licensed and bonded. The actual licensed and bonded immigration consultants comply and they don't overcharge. And
I'm going to just
yeah.
hold on and see if there's any other questions in the room for the panel and the audience that's specific to the group. Yes, go ahead, thanks.
Dr. Vargas, you
Mhm.
mentioned that you had a few issues with some wording.
Mhm.
Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Yeah, sure. It's just, once again, and this is coming a lot from the legal jargon or language that is used, of course. And it's, like I referred to, it's family units, unaccompanied minors. So I feel already in a very kind of I just think it adds to the dehumanizing rhetoric, right? Already in the very limiting conditions that we have, especially in legal proceedings or media representations and articles, right? That once again kind of, and I understand the reason why the actual names are not used of these children or photographs, right? But that's what I also think, that sometimes the legal system is set up to further dehumanize these children. So calling family units or unaccompanied minors, right, I just feel further erases the humanity of these children.